Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I want to say, first of all, thanks to Bob Bennett and Travis Lewis and Adam Maness for putting all this together. It's fantastic to be a part of Jazz St. Louis, to be a part of this amazing organization. And I have a great story to talk about today with Radiohead and their fascination with jazz and how jazz changed them and almost saved their careers. At one time, in 1997, Radiohead was facing the labels of sort of being the end of grunge, right? And labels are a tough thing for us as creative people, right? Because if you have a label, you're boxed into a corner of who you are for the industry. I mean, just think about your life. Do you like labels? Right? They work when we like them. Like, he was always a good dancer. Johnny was the second kid in our family. He was always a great dancer. But if that label isn't positive, it can have a negative influence. Like, oh, he was never a good dancer. And I think Radiohead is facing that sort of situation with not just labels as music, but record labels themselves, right? And what Radiohead does brilliantly is turn to jazz to change the trajectory of their career. Labels help us organize things, but they also help box us in sometimes. And so we might be wondering, like, well, what are we doing here talking about Radiohead? This is a jazz thing. Big deal, Radiohead likes jazz. Or you might be saying, why should I care about Radiohead's story? I'm not really a Radiohead fan. I support Jazz St. Louis, and I'm more interested in bebop. But they are too. And what's amazing is Radiohead is sort of this group that brings more people into jazz and in a very interesting way takes jazz people into Radiohead. This story starts in 1997. U2 is in somewhat of a retirement, and the record industry is looking for Radiohead to take the reins and lead us into the rock future. And Radiohead turns to Miles Davis instead of U2. Radiohead says, we're going in a different direction. We don't think we can live up to that sort of industry expectations. They released OK Computer, a very jazz-influenced album, and Capitol Records immediately downgraded it to 400,000 sales expectations instead of 2 million. Today, the album ended up selling 7 million copies at least. What's interesting is also that this wasn't happening in complete daylight at the time. In 1997, Radiohead is borrowing jazz, and jazz musicians begin borrowing Radiohead at the same time, not really knowing that each other were borrowing from each other, or that we were borrowing the same material maybe. In 2000, Radiohead comes out with their album Kid A, and their entrance music is Alice Coltrane, which is not something you would expect to hear in a stadium, right? You wouldn't expect Radiohead to walk out and hear Alice Coltrane from 1972. So what's going on behind the story here? At the same time, Radiohead released Kid A, and it's a big success, and people go nuts for the album, but it doesn't have a hit. It doesn't have a real, like, tangible rock song anymore. Half of the rock critics really question it. The other half support it, but the fans went nuts for it because it was something different in there. And that thing that saves Radiohead is the jazz thing we're talking about today. All right, the other thing is, well, maybe you're thinking, big deal, like jazz musicians like Radiohead, like, what does that matter to me? We're going to get to that question also. I was part of that question in 1999 or so. I noticed that everybody was playing Radiohead tunes all of a sudden in the jazz community, and it kind of crescendoed for the next 10 years. It's one of the few really big jazz stories that I remember in that whole period, that there was almost like a Radiohead jazz movement. And when I started doing some research on this question, like, why do jazz musicians like Radiohead? One interesting thing that Johnny Greenwood, the guitarist from Radiohead, said was, we should have gotten sued for all the jazz we stole, not the rock. I said, like, what's going on here? I don't quite hear it. I love their music, but what is he talking about? So we're here to talk about Radiohead's dealing with labels. We're talking about the puzzles they leave for us, that in the same way, like Miles Davis' Bitches Brew, that they're very influenced by, is a puzzle that he has left for us. We're also talking about Radiohead as sort of prophetic in how to save yourself from labels, or how to change the industry. And also the story of rediscovering themselves through Miles Davis, through Alice Coltrane, through Charles Mingus. They're very prophetic. They were ahead of the idea of us being sort of boxed in, and I think recently we've all kind of felt boxed in, right? Their lyrics begin having these words that are sort of sarcastic towards the world, that we're all going to be fitter, happier, more productive, comfortable, eating well, no more microwave dinners, no saturated fats, drive better, a safer car, baby smile. Like, all of this is just kind of too much for us to hold together in society. They also started sampling Apple's computer voices and putting them into their music, which is very like foreshadowing of us using Alexa in all of our daily activities, or using Siri to fix our problems. And this is 1997. They're interested in this question of technology trying to help us out, but then actually kind of taking over our decisions for us. In 2007, they were really prophetic in this idea of selling direct to the consumer. They stopped using their label, and they said, we're just going to release our album in rainbows, and you can pay us what you want. I remember very clearly, anybody that was around remembers it was a game changer because it was this amazing publicity stunt, and on average, the average person gave them $9.50 for their record by donation. Again, it kind of foreshadows where we're at in the music industry today, when many musicians work, and the music isn't the big sort of product, it's more the part of the package of the person, that you're buying into the culture of the musician. Radiohead is also prophetic and looking ahead in their songs. Burn the Witch, 2 years before the Clinton versus Trump election, in which we have all these kind of lock her up chants, and Radiohead was a year ahead of that, saying burn the witch and all this sort of Islamophobia that's coming in to the sort of political dialogue. But what's interesting is that in 1997, they were aware of the buzzing sound of technology, right? Which I remember not feeling really bothered by it at the time. I think a very few number of people had cell phones in 1997, right? Most of us didn't have a laptop. We might have had a computer at home. But Tom York and Greenwood and the band were very aware of this feeling that technology is beginning to get into our life, right? And that there's no spiritual world left in our soul and in our society. And they begin turning to look for answers. And those answers are not going to come from the music they've been creating. They have to get it from Miles. They have to get it from Alice. They have to get it from Mingus. These questions about why society is messed up can only be answered by people outside of rock and roll. In 1997, there were a bunch of fears that they had to deal with as a rock band. All right, maybe grunge is over, right? And it kind of was, right? If we look at Nirvana, Kurt Cobain is gone. The genre is winding down. So what are you going to do as an artist? The other fear they have is that there's only 12 notes in this scale. And if you go sit at the piano, there's only 12 notes before they all start repeating. Well, and if a chord is a combination of 3 notes, what are you going to do that you haven't done already? What are you going to do the entire history of people sitting in front of the piano hasn't done before? So they asked their audiences, and they said, can you please send us some chords to make new music with, which they did. And they also began to ask Alice Coltrane, and they began to ask Miles Davis, what do we do when these notes don't go anywhere anymore? What if we're tired of these campy chord progressions? And Miles and Alice will give them the answers in a sense, get rid of them. Get rid of the things that aren't working. Get down to a chord with 1 note. Get down to a chord that just sits there for 5 or 6 minutes. The other thing they're thinking about is, if you let the industry decide who you are, you're probably going to die with grunge music, which is, we could safely say, is part of the past now. And at that point, they, in a sense, begin transitioning to this new world, this new idea of what they are as a group. And they also had this other fear that Tom York mentioned in interviews, what if we became famous too soon? What if we're not good enough to do this? Or what if we don't have time to grow into being a real band? Because they had a hit real early with Creep. And what if you're just the Creep band? Because that's what they were known as. There was a one-hit wonder made famous by Beavis and Butthead on MTV. And what if that's all we are? What if that's all we're going to be? They came from a great sort of like artistic background. Tom York was an art school student. And he knew sort of these mechanics of being an artist that you have to be willing to change. He says in 1997, you have to be willing to throw it all away. The moment you can't let go of what you're doing, the moment it's over. Very powerful and hard thing to do as a musician, to say, whatever we've done, this has to be the end of it, and we have to start something new. And he turns to the leader of that idea, the sort of modern inventor idea that comes from, most notably in jazz, Miles Davis. And Miles didn't just give them the sound of the music they were looking for. Miles also gave them the philosophical idea that if you stop changing, it's over. In order to understand what Radiohead does with jazz, we got to talk for a second about kind of building up a language of how art works. All right, art and science exist through a world of symbols. We use symbols to name things, right? When we talked earlier about labels. Symbols help us label things, right? We use symbols to create awareness of objects. If I drew some numbers on the wall here, would that be art or would it be mathematics, right? It depends. If I drew a whole bunch of numbers up here and a symbol like plus sign, minus sign, and all that, what is it? You know, it sort of depends. Because art and science both share this language of symbols, they have this intersection point. Right? We use symbols to represent things. We use symbols to name things. We use symbols to describe things. In order to create music, we manipulate symbols and we invert them, we distort them, we weight them, we delete things, we extend a symbol or stretch it out. Like if I took a painting of the Mona Lisa and I put a happy face on top of it, right? That would be a collage. If I took the Mona Lisa and I stretched her face out, that's distortion. If I put her upside down, that's inversion. If I took her hair off, then that would be deletion. These are just the rules of how art works. What's interesting about Radiohead is that they're going to look to jazz and they're going to use the symbols of jazz, but they're going to use the structures of jazz, and they're going to model their music after the structures of the songs that they like. No, I've never seen a group do this. That's why I'm here talking about this today, because I've seen all kinds of borrowing. People have stolen licks from people. That's part of jazz history. People have, stolen songs. But what Radiohead does is we're going to borrow the structure of the way somebody thinks, and we're going to build a system of music that follows the way Mingus's prayer meeting goes. We're going to build a song that doesn't sound anything like Alice Coltrane or doesn't sound anything like John Coltrane, but we're going to build a parallel song to it, and then we'll know that our structure is sound because it came from somebody that we appreciate. Interesting thing, if you went to, there was a recent poll of 1,300 college students, and if you went to Stanford, Harvard, or Yale, Radiohead was the most popular choice of student listeners. It doesn't mean you're smart if you listen to Radiohead. There's definitely a social aspect to it. But it does mean that you're probably interested in music that involves puzzles, music that's hard to understand, music that doesn't give you everything directly, that is more tangled up for you to think about. The bad news is if you listen to Bon Jovi, you have probably the lower SAT scores or went to a different college because Bon Jovi is not in the listening list of people at Stanford. That's my Bon Jovi joke. Is your music a reflection of who you are? Yes, it's a reflection of like your social group, but it's also a reflection of how you think, right? It reflects your study habits. It reflects like if you're career-driven, your self-esteem, your tolerance for puzzles, and your interest in complex art, your interest in things you can't understand the first time you hear it. And one thing that Radiohead is aware of is that you have to steal, right? That all great art, all great music, it's all handed down. It's borrowed from one person to the next, and we only borrow that information and really hand it on to the next person. For example, Like it's in art, it's real easy to accuse people of stealing or songs being stolen. Like Radiohead songs sometimes use mirrors, but we wouldn't say that about using the Hubble telescope, right? To look into space. Like if Miles Davis looked into something really deep, he looks into space, there's something there that he saw. That is just like common knowledge that we should all look at that picture because he saw something we haven't. That's the way they think about it as an artistic group. We're going to listen to their early hit, Creep. What you're going to listen for here is kind of cool, is a borrowed melody. They use the bridge from the Hollies song. They use the chords, the lyrics, and the lyrics are a counterpoint to the original song, which is a habit we're going to see in their later examples also. That they listen to the Hollies, and then they sing a verse about angels going back to the angels in the Hollies song. It's not a steal, it's really a counterpoint to their influences.
If I could make a wish, I think I'd pass. Can't think of anything I need. I don't belong here.
Right, so Radiohead, this was their first historic sort of model. They really liked the Hollies song. They ended up having, the Hollies ended up claiming the song in court, and Radiohead almost never plays Creep live anymore. The Hollies get all the money from Creep. In 1997, again, this is when they begin to look for something different to pull them out of rock and roll. Phil Selway, the drummer for Radiohead in 2001, said, talking about how they made this sort of switch in OK Computer in 97, said, there's some tracks that are not direct copies, and Ed O'Brien kind of interrupts, says, there were reference points, very much reference points. And they described it as like aiming for the jazz that you liked, but you keep missing. In the next example, this is a cool little merger from What a Wonderful World into Radiohead's No Surprises. You're going to hear that the melody of No Surprises is a sort of a counterpoint to Louis Armstrong's melody. Louis Armstrong's melody goes up optimistically, what a beautiful world. Radiohead's No Surprises is like, yeah, but it's not that great, right? Our melody goes down in the opposite direction. And it's also the first time Radiohead ever wrote a song in the key of F, which is the same key as What a Wonderful World. And they said that they listened to this and jammed off it. They took the idea of Louis Armstrong's Utopia and said, yeah, we still believe in Utopia, but it's still kind of messed up, right? Utopia is a progression, and we're still working on Utopia.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
So they're very like supportive in a sense of Louis Armstrong's world, but Tom York always has this sort of outsider's view, and this like partly from his childhood of seeing the way people are and like seeing the negativity of people at all ages, and seeing that it's utopia is like a process or a hope. We never really get there, but he brings a different perspective to it, that it's a work. It's not just an idea. You have to work at it, and no surprises. One of their next influences is Alice Coltrane. They turned to Coltrane, and they said in interviews that they would put on Alice's Coltrane albums, Journey to Sachin-Danawa, and they would put it on the headphones and they would just jam. And they would get rid of the whole process of like trying to be a rock band, because they really felt the music of Coltrane beginning to take them into a different place. It also comes from John Coltrane's influence, where Tom York said somebody gave him a tape of Coltrane interview where Coltrane talked about a universal religion, and they begin to like use that in their music. In their albums, Kid A, you're going to see this sort of universal religion. Like it's a religion that's not, it's spiritual, but it's not denominational. It's like all of us need to find a spiritual place, and like music is the way out of this like cold digital world that we live in, and music is going to help us like be the spiritual truth of who we are. And they get down into this deep land of Egyptology and Alice Coltrane, and this sort of transcendence that she goes through in her music of like searching for Egypt. They go through that searching for who they are in a digital world. In York's song, Pyramid Song, he says, I looked in the water, and what did I see? It's pretty much a straight reference to over the River Jordan. I looked over the River Jordan, and what did I see? You can see in this image the symbolism here of the Radiohead sort of crossing the Nile with their animated character in this boat, and he's crossing over this like divided, different world of the modern life, but still referencing this Egyptology of Alice Coltrane. It's a great image from their album, Coltrane's Spirituality for Digital Migrants, but Robot Instructions for Digital Natives. It's real interesting. They saw themselves very early on as digital migrants. They grew up before we had telephones in our hand all the time, and they saw themselves creating music for these digital natives. And so in this image, you see these sort of cubes, which are the natives, the sort of children of Kid A, like crossing over this spiritual mountain, and you see the characters of Radiohead that are digital migrants in the background, like trying to communicate with these people. Like, it's very common like conversation now about the difference between people who grew up without technology and the people that have just been born with it. And they're very aware of that early on, before it was sort of a talking point. And the next example, Blue Nile, we're going to hear a mix from Alice Coltrane's Blue Nile going into Pyramid Song. You'll hear very similar characteristics in the drum rhythm. You'll hear the Phrygian chord progression. You'll hear this pentatonic melody. And like I said before, this over-the-river idea of Egyptology and like finding your values on the river. And you'll definitely hear Alice Coltrane's harp in this.
Maybe I think you're crazy. Maybe stop
Right. So the coldness of the digital world is like dealt with through the harp of Alice Coltrane. The like what they're looking for musically becomes symbolic of what the generation needs in a sense to move on, to like find some truth in this new digital world that is increasingly feeling colder and colder. And also the space of their music. It just starts to become very much like a Coltrane vamp or a Coltrane pedal in Love Supreme. This next example, that was motion picture soundtrack we just listened to. The next example is Blue Nile going into Radiohead's Pyramid Song. So we've got some cool references there. We got the Black-Eyed Angels taken from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. We have the idea of the Egyptian river, and we have this sort of pentatonic melody that he sings real strong, kind of like, just like a Coltrane saxophone sound, and the way he phrases that pentatonic melody. And these references aren't meant to take you to Alice Coltrane. They're meant to like answer the question of where do we go now? Like he's trying to figure out how to get out of rock and roll. And instead of trying to go forward, he's going backwards with the astral cars and all the references to the 70s. Pretty much from like 1970 to 1973, they're borrowing like a real specific period of jazz music as the answer to get it through this like digital world that they feel trapped in. The next example, we're going to hear John Coltrane's Ole go into Radiohead's Everything in the Right Place, a very similar chord progression of C to C sharp to E flat. Not to get like too technical on it, but it's Andalusian, Phrygian progression that Coltrane uses, and Radiohead uses it here. This isn't necessarily to say that this is a direct steal, but it's not one of those progressions you just run into. Okay, you don't just run into Andalusian, Phrygian chords walking down the street. It's not common to use. So where did they get it? It's like they either borrowed it from Coltrane or heard Coltrane do it or heard it on a different album. But again, what's great is that Coltrane goes to this progression and Radiohead's like, yeah, man, I'll go to that. We'll take the band to that chord progression and we're going to put it in the digital world that we're now moved into. And then this is like that Phrygian thing is going to take us somewhere that we don't have in the digital music right now. what's great about this is you hear the tonic, like the root note, getting bigger and bigger in this period of their music. This like sort of Coltrane vamp. Like when Coltrane got deeper, he had to get rid of the chords. Right? He had to get down to like playing one big chord, one monolithic chord. And here goes Radiohead doing the same thing. Let's get rid of, we have these three chords passing, but the C in there, like that pedal point, becomes stronger and stronger. And that gives you that sort of spiritual feeling, right? You need a foundation to get to a deeper place. If you have chords that keep moving, it's hard to be spiritual because you're in your thinking side of your brain. But they're sort of like defeating chord progressions by making the tonic bigger and bigger and bigger. Then again, they said they used to practice to Coltrane albums, Alice Coltrane specifically, and they would put them on to clear out everything they were doing. And you can almost just hear them warming up over this song because it has so much space. They're going to borrow this droning feel. They're also going to borrow the string arrangements that Alice Coltrane used, like real simple strings and octaves that they'll use for the rest of their career.
The entire universe is created with love, by love, and in love. Love is the beginning, love is the continuation, and love is the end. Love for love's sake is divine. It is constructive. It is beautiful.
It's just interesting, at this same time, Radiohead's audience is kind of changing. The people that used to like Radiohead might not like them, but they're getting this big, huge audience of new people that are drawn into Radiohead for something different. There's something about Radiohead that doesn't sound like other rock bands. All the other rock bands are kind of trying to do what they've done, or maybe they're stuck in their genre. And Radiohead doesn't really know where they're going. They just know what their influences are that are helping them, and they're using the guidance of the people they respect to move forward. The next example is a beautiful mirror of Radiohead's national anthem with Mingus's prayer meeting. What you're going to listen for here is the freedom, the sequence, and the layers of things that happen, and then there's these big fermatas at the end. They created a perfect mirror of this song in terms of the events of the song without it all sounding like they borrowed the song. Right? That's what I fell in love with when I discovered this example. Was this doesn't sound at all like prayer meeting. What's amazing is that they borrowed the energy, they borrowed the event sequence of Mingus, and Mingus is shouting, and his events of layers, like an identical mirror. And you can see that layer here if you map out, like I did, I mapped out Radiohead over the top and Mingus's prayer meeting on the bottom. And you can see the cluster of events that happen from the way the music happens, like they said, their electro jazz blueprint that was going to help them move forward. So this is going to be a nice clip rolling between tracks. They didn't say, let's borrow jazz. They didn't say, let's do a jazz album. They said, jazz shows us how to do us, in a sense, right? Jazz gives us a blueprint for how we should sort of behave or how we should construct our music. Same exact instrumentation as Mingus's horn section. Same structural events that happen. doesn't sound at all like it. And that's sort of where they've come from, or where they've gotten to as a borrowing group. Like, they use what they like as the map to be successful. York described it in '97, really interesting. He said, it's like taking Polaroids of things happening at high speed, and you don't really get it perfectly. You create an impression of it. And again, Johnny Greenwood called it electro jazz blueprint. Jazz was their blueprint for their new style. And this is when Radiohead becomes a big deal. But like before OK Computer, before Kid A, Radiohead's a popular band. But the industry thought that this was maybe the end when Capitol downgrades their sales forecast. But Radiohead's turn to jazz is the beginning of this sort of new Radiohead that the new fans really like. We're going to listen to one more example that's probably the most specific. This is a mashup of Kinetic by Radiohead and Miles Davis's Miles Runs the Voodoo Down. I created this mashup. If you start Miles Davis's song at 0, and you can do this on YouTube yourself, if you start Radiohead's Kinetic at 7 seconds and you put the songs on, this mashup is exactly how they line up. You can hear Tom York singing back to Miles Davis. You can hear that the bass line is borrowed. You can hear that the drums have been sampled. You can hear that the chaos at about 2 minutes into the song happens at the same time. That this wasn't just checking out Miles. You know, this is a whole nother thing. This is a deeper level of like learning from Miles with the headphones on and then singing back to him and taking those drum samples that you like and playing along with it and then creating something new. What's interesting also about this moment is that Tom York says, "You're being took for a ride," this first lyric. And Miles Davis, right before he sings that, Miles Davis plays a quote from C.C. Ryder. "See what you have done," and Miles Davis sees "you're being took for a ride." Like, it's a really deep way of borrowing that you would get as a visual artist. You know, painters know this, that you copy other painters, and you even when we were kids, we paint and we learn to draw by lines before you learn to fill in the blank and fill in the boxes. And that sort of idea of collage is what helps them get out of their rut. So this is a real short clip of Miles Runs the Voodoo Down. This is from Bitches Brew, 1970. Let's listen to Radiohead's Kinetic for a second. You can hear the synthesizer is derived from the drum feel too. Other interesting thing is the title, the name Kinetic. It means energy between two places, right? It means energy, like borrowed energy that is in between like potential and where the energy is headed. The title kind of gives it away. And he says, "You're being took for a ride, C.C. Ryder, and you're too lazy to make your own music," in a sense, in his next lyric. So let's listen to these two songs mashed up together. Might need to turn this one up a little bit. So we hear Miles and Radiohead here. C.C. Ryder. All right, let's kind of move on. So you can, that's with no editing. That's just, if you play the Miles track and you play the York track, I didn't cut or splice anything. You can get the same effect where you hear them, you hear Radiohead really following Miles to the Voodoo, right? Following the way he develops his music. You can find him following that chaos and playing over the top of it. Same chords. Miles' chord is basically F7, sharp 9, and Radiohead kind of mixes it, turns it just barely into F minor, but they're like still very overlapping in like how they're interpreting the language of Miles. The bass part is moved over by a beat, and then they like sampled the last two notes and then repeated it. The drum pattern like plays in counterpoint to Don Elias's original drum rhythm from Miles's album in the 70s. Radiohead breaks the rules and the genre to escape the labels, you know. They, in order to get to save rock, as they're often called the saviors of rock, they had to get outside of their own limitations. They had to get outside of what they were used to doing as musicians. At the same time, Radiohead, along this journey, kind of trades in their audience and gets this new audience of people that are looking for something different. Their audience grows. I'm not saying that the original fans didn't still like Radiohead, but they become a different group than they were in those early years. So maybe you're saying, well, what does this have to do with jazz? And like, I like Joshua Redman and Brad Mehldau and all those guys. At the same time, jazz musicians began stealing Radiohead, not really knowing that we were borrowing jazz from Radiohead that had borrowed jazz, if that makes sense. I mean, it starts with Brad Mehldau in 1998. He begins recording Radiohead songs, and other groups like the Bad Plus said it was all about Brad Mehldau. He's the first one that was really trying to go somewhere different. And Mehldau said, I want to stop going backwards. Like in his rhythm section, they played a couple months at the Village Vanguard, and he said, I want this song to go forward. I want to stop going backwards with jazz. And when he's playing these Radiohead tunes, he's kind of like trying to deal with society of today and keep jazz relevant, by looking to Radiohead and playing their tunes to help him lean into the future. Nice little list of people that have recorded Radiohead tunes. And again, I'm not saying people didn't know, but it wasn't common knowledge that Radiohead was borrowing jazz to make their music. And so it's really interesting to me that Chris Potter, the Bad Plus, EST, Christian Scott, Robert Glasper, Joshua Redman, John Mayer, Jamie Cullum, and Meldau all recorded Radiohead tunes in this sort of cloud of not really knowing that we were borrowing jazz back from the people who used jazz to move out of rock and roll. In a sense, jazz created the real Radiohead. The Radiohead that we like is inspired by the people like Miles and Coltrane. And even like Tom York recently said, if he had to take 10 CDs to a desert island, he said he would take Sidney Bechet as one of his mom taught him. And when he was a kid, she was an art major, but she always listened to jazz and got him into it at a young age. Again, he said it's like taking Polaroids of the things you like and doing impressions of things, but not really hitting it right on the head. So I asked you at the beginning, do you like labels? And Radiohead said they felt like, quote, it's been destroying the people who try to make the music. Right? The labels that had been put on them were the thing that prevented them from going forward. So, like, if you were to ask them, what does this have to do with my life? Like, maybe if you've been labeled, you have to say, okay, I need to ask people that aren't in this genre how to fix these problems. How do we fix these creative problems? That's what Radiohead did. They said, you can't get the same answers from the same people. If you're not getting the answers you're looking for musically, maybe you need to go ask other people. Maybe you need to ask other types of musicians. If I ask everybody, all my jazz friends, questions about music, I'm always going to get these sort of jazz answers. And what they did that's so brilliant is they said, start asking other people outside of your genre. Thanks again for having me. My email is pete@interactivelistening.com. If you have any follow-up questions, I'd love to talk to you. I love talking about jazz and Radiohead, and I'm looking forward to playing all this great music. So thanks again to Jazz St. Louis for having me, and thank you. example is a mashup of No Surprises, and which is derived from Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World. In this example, Radiohead takes a look at the world and said, this isn't quite utopia of Louis Armstrong. So why don't we write a counterpoint to that? Not in a negative way. It's a sort of reminder that we're the caretaker of this world. It's also the first time Radiohead ever recorded in F, right? Which is the same key as Wonder Wonderful World. The arpeggios of What a Wonderful World go up, and Radiohead kind of inverts that. It also goes to D flat. They kind of follow the chord progression of Louis Armstrong, and the melody is also sort of a counterpoint that goes in the opposite directions of Armstrong. So again, it's just sort of a reminder of, yes, we have a beautiful world, but if we don't take care of it, we have a world filled with carbon monoxide and Radiohead's lyrics. So I hope you enjoy it.
job that slowly kills you, bruises that won't heal. You look so tired and unhappy. Bring down the government, they don't speak. They don't speak for us. I'll take a quiet life. I'll take a handshake of carbon monoxide with no alarms and no surprises, no alarms and no surprises, no alarms and no surprises. This is my final fit, my final bellyache with no alarms and no surprises, no alarms and no surprises, no alarms and no surprises.
next piece is called Kinetic Voodoo. It's a mashup of Miles Davis's Miles Runs the Voodoo Down with Radiohead's Kinetic, which is derived from Miles' tune. Right after Miles plays this quote from C.C. Ryder in his solo, you hear Tom York say, "You're being took for a ride," as if you're being taken for a ride, C.C. Ryder. You also hear these two competing bass lines. You'll hear the original bass line from Bitches Brew, and then you'll hear Radiohead's bass line. It's a beat off where they sampled it and put an extra beat on the end of it. And what's the most beautiful about this is, again, if you line up the two tracks and you start Radiohead's tune 8 seconds later, you can do this with 2 channels on YouTube, you can hear Tom York singing and Miles Davis playing back. So it's a beautiful call and response relationship that we have in the horns here. The horns will represent Miles' solo, and you'll hear Tom York singing back and forth. Thanks. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
Please keep moving. Don't stop moving. Please keep moving.
So about this time, Radiohead is looking for a way out of rock and roll. They're looking for a way out of chord progressions. They're looking for new chords. They asked their fans, send us chords and we'll write a new tune with it. And their fans sent them chords and they still didn't work because when you've only got 12 notes and you've got 3 notes in a chord, you run out of chords pretty quick. You can run out of progressions quick. And this tune seems to like draw from their interest in Coltrane. John Coltrane's Ole and Alice Coltrane's used this called Andalusian Phrygian progression quite a lot. And what's neat about this is that Radiohead's looking for a way out of chord progressions, and they find this cool chord progression, but at the same time, the root is getting louder and louder, and that sound here is the vocal part singing Kid A, Kid A, Kid A, Kid A, Kid A, Kid A. The tonic is getting bigger, and so to get out of progressions, they're killing the chords, and you're left with just a big giant tonic. So we hope you enjoy everything in its right place.
In its right place, in its right place, in its right place, in its right place. Yesterday I woke up sucking on lemon. Yes, I woke up sucking on lemon. Yesterday I woke up sucking on lemon. Yesterday I woke up sucking on lemon. Every day, every day, every
right, so this next one is a mashup of Alice Coltrane's Blue Nile and Radiohead's Pyramid Song. They're not exactly derivative, but this is a part of Radiohead, the band's career, especially Tom York is deep into the spiritual world of Coltrane culture and Coltrane universal religion and trying to find a religion that's above all religions or something that brings religions together. And in this one, we hear references to the black-eyed angels of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. We also hear references to the River Jordan. And look, I went over to the river and what did I see? Referring to an ancient African-American spiritual. So in this song, Radiohead's bringing together this spiritual world of trying to find their own spirituality in the digital world, but trying to find it through the language of Coltrane.